When a battered mail-order bride steps off the train in 1867 Nebraska expecting another cruel master, she instead meets a silent cowboy whose gentle hands speak louder than any words ever could. As her violent past arrives to drag her back into darkness, will the quiet strength of a man who communicates through patient actions be enough to teach her wounded heart what true love actually means? The train's whistle screamed across the empty prairie like a dying animal, cutting through the October silence of 1867 with a sound that made Violet's bones ache. She pressed her face against the cold window glass, watching the Nebraska Territory roll past in waves of golden grass that seemed to stretch forever under a sky so big it made her feel like a tiny insect. Her fingers found the small silver locket hidden beneath her dress collar, the only thing left from her real mother, not the woman who'd married her stepfather and brought hell into their house. The metal felt warm against her skin, a reminder that once, long ago, someone had loved her without wanting to hurt her. The other passengers chatted and laughed, pointing at the wild landscape with excitement. Violet pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to make herself smaller in the hard seat. She'd learned that being small meant being safe, though lately even that hadn't worked. A baby cried somewhere behind her, and the sound made her stomach twist. She'd helped deliver babies back in Philadelphia, back when her hands were allowed to heal instead of just protect. Those memories felt like stories from someone else's life now. The train began to slow, and Violet's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Clearwater Station appeared through the dust, a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been dropped onto the prairie by accident. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business, unaware that a broken girl was about to step into their world. She touched the letter in her pocket for the 100th time. Gabriel Morrison had written it in careful, neat handwriting, promising a home and protection in exchange for marriage. His words had been simple and honest, nothing like the flowery lies men usually told. That scared her almost as much as it gave her hope. The conductor called out, "Clearwater Station, end of the line." Violet stood on shaking legs, gripping her carpetbag with white knuckles. Everything she owned fit in that one small bag. A few dresses, her mother's Bible, and the faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes who died too young to protect her daughter from the monsters that came after. Other passengers pushed past her, eager to reach their destinations. She moved slowly, each step toward the door feeling like walking toward her own execution. The autumn air hit her face as she stepped onto the platform, carrying scents she'd never smelled before. Prairie grass, wood smoke, and something clean and wild that made her lungs feel bigger. The platform buzzed with activity. Families hugged and cried with joy. Men loaded cargo onto wagons. Children ran between the adults, playing games that made them shriek with laughter. Violet stood in the middle of it all, feeling invisible and exposed at the same time. She searched the crowd for a man she'd never seen, someone who might be Gabriel Morrison. Her stepfather had described her in the letters he'd written for her, but she wondered what Gabriel expected. Did he know about the bruises? About the way she flinched when doors slammed? About the nightmares that woke her up screaming? A group of cowboys rode past, their horses' hoofs thundering on the dirt road. One of them tipped his hat to her, and she automatically stepped backward, bumping into a wooden post. The cowboy's face showed confusion at her reaction, but he rode on without stopping. Violet's breathing came in short gasps. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she should get back on the train and find somewhere else to hide. But the train was already pulling away, carrying her last chance of escape with it. "Miss Hartwell," the voice came from somewhere to her left, deep and quiet like distant thunder. She turned slowly, afraid of what she might see, and found herself looking at a man who seemed to be carved from the same wood as the buildings around them. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were simple but clean, a white shirt, brown vest, and pants that had seen honest work. He held his hat in his hands, and she noticed how careful he was to keep distance between them. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the platform. He nodded once, a small movement that somehow felt like a promise. "I'm Gabriel Morrison. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult. She stared at him, searching for signs of the cruelty she'd learned to expect from men. But his face held only patience, and his eyes never wandered from her face to places they shouldn't go. When he reached toward her bag, she jerked backwards so violently that several people turned to stare. Gabriel's hand stopped in midair, then slowly dropped to his side. I'm sorry. I should have asked first. The simple apology hit Violet like a physical blow, not because it hurt, but because she couldn't remember the last time someone had said sorry to her for anything. She stared at Gabriel Morrison, this stranger who just treated her like a person worthy of respect, and felt something crack open inside her chest. I can carry it myself, she said, clutching the carpet bag against her body like armor. Of course you can. Gabriel's voice held no impatience, no anger at her refusal of help. My wagon's just over there, when you're ready. He turned and walked toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 horses, moving with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. Violet followed at a distance, watching how he moved. No sudden gestures, no quick turns that might startle her. It was like he understood something about fear that most people never learned. The wagon was clean and well-maintained, with a thick blanket folded on the seat. Gabriel climbed up and settled the reins in his hands, then waited while she struggled to pull herself up beside him. She noticed he didn't offer to help this time, somehow knowing she needed to do it herself. As they rolled away from the station, Violet got her first real look at the town. Clearwater Station was bigger than she'd expected. A main street lined with shops, a church with a white steeple, houses scattered around the edges like seeds blown by the wind. People waved at Gabriel as they passed, and he nodded back with quiet politeness. It's not much like Philadelphia, Gabriel said, the first words he'd spoken since they'd left the platform. No, sir. Violet kept her eyes on her hands, twisted together in her lap. It's different. Different how? The question surprised her. Most men didn't ask her opinion about anything. Bigger sky, she said finally. More space. Gabriel nodded as if her answer made perfect sense. Takes some getting used to. The quiet can be loud when you're not expecting it. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking a steady rhythm against the dirt road. Violet found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, but gentle with the horses. When a rabbit darted across the road, he eased the wagon to a stop until the animal was safely across. Tell me about your family, Gabriel said as they started moving again. The question she'd been dreading. There's not much to tell. Your stepfather wrote that your mother passed when you were young. Yes, sir. Fever took her when I was 12. The words came out flat and emotionless, the way she'd learned to speak about painful things. That must have been hard. Something in his tone made her look up. His face showed genuine concern, not the fake sympathy she was used to hearing. It was, she admitted. And your stepfather raised you after that? The innocent question hit like a knife blade. Violet's hands clenched in her lap, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that meant panic was coming. He did his best, she lied. Gabriel's jaw tightened slightly, and she wondered what he'd heard in her voice. But he didn't push, didn't demand details she couldn't give. Instead, he pointed to a cluster of buildings in the distance. That's home, he said simply. The Morrison homestead spread across a valley where cottonwood trees whispered secrets to the wind. The house was 2 stories tall, built from logs that had been carefully fitted together. A porch wrapped around the front, with chairs that looked like they'd been placed for watching sunsets. Behind the house, she could see a barn, a chicken coop, and what looked like a vegetable garden. It's beautiful, Violet breathed, forgetting to be afraid for a moment. It's peaceful, Gabriel agreed. Sometimes that's the most beautiful thing of all. As they approached the house, Violet noticed details that spoke of careful attention. Flowers planted along the walkway, windows that sparkled clean in the afternoon sun, a swing hanging from the porch roof that moved gently in the breeze. Gabriel helped her down from the wagon, this time offering his hand but not insisting when she hesitated. She finally took it, surprised by the calluses that spoke of honest work and the gentleness that spoke of a careful heart. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. Everything had its place, and that place was clean and orderly. Sunlight streamed through windows hung with curtains that someone had sewn with love. The floors were wood, polished to a warm glow, and braided rugs added color to the rooms. "Your room is upstairs," Gabriel said, leading her to a staircase that didn't creak under their feet. "I hope you'll find it comfortable." The room he showed her was larger than any space she'd ever called her own. A bed with a star-pattern quilt dominated one wall, and a dresser with a mirror stood near the window. But what made her breath catch was the lock on the inside of the door. A simple metal latch that would keep the world out if she needed it to. "I thought you might like your privacy," Gabriel said, noticing where her eyes had gone. Violet touched the lock with trembling fingers, feeling the solid click as it engaged. Such a small thing, but it meant everything. "Thank you," she whispered. When she turned around, Gabriel was already gone, leaving her alone with the first real safety she'd known in years. The sound of breaking dishes shattered the morning silence like gunshots, sending Violet diving under the kitchen table before she even realized what had happened. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears as she crouched there, waiting for the angry voice that always followed broken things in her old life. Instead, she heard Gabriel's boots on the porch, moving slow and steady. The kitchen door opened with a gentle creak, and she saw his worn leather boots stop just inside the doorway. "Violet!" His voice carried no anger, just concern. "Are you hurt?" She crawled out from under the table, her face burning with shame. The coffee cup lay in pieces on the floor, brown liquid spreading across the clean boards she'd scrubbed just yesterday. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll clean it up. I'll replace it. Please don't." "Don't what?" Gabriel knelt down and began picking up the larger pieces, his movements careful and unhurried. Violet stared at him, confused by his calmness. "Aren't you angry?" Gabriel looked up at her with those storm cloud eyes, and she saw something there that made her chest feel tight. "It's just a cup, Violet. I've got plenty more." She helped him gather the broken pieces, their hands nearly touching as they worked. When he didn't pull away or make her feel foolish, something inside her began to unwind, just a little. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as steady as Gabriel's footsteps on the porch each morning. He would leave fresh eggs by her door before dawn, never knocking, never demanding thanks. She would find them there like small gifts from a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Violet discovered that Gabriel owned more books than she'd ever seen in one place. They lined shelves in the main room. Stories of adventure, books about farming and horses, even poetry that someone had read so many times the pages were soft as cloth. When she asked about them, Gabriel simply said, "Reading passes the time when the wind gets too loud." She began to understand what he meant. The prairie wind never stopped, sometimes gentle as a whisper, sometimes howling like all the lonely souls in the world. At night, it made the house creak and sigh, but instead of feeling trapped, Violet found the sounds comforting. The house felt solid around her, a shelter that nothing bad could shake. Gabriel worked from sunup to sundown, tending his horses, fixing fences, preparing for winter. Violet watched him from the kitchen window as she cooked and cleaned, noticing how the animals trusted him. His horses would come when he called, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Even the barn cats, wild as prairie grass, would let him scratch behind their ears. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on the line, she heard Gabriel talking to someone near the barn. A neighbor man had come to buy a horse, and their voices carried on the autumn air. "That's a fine mare you've got there, Morrison," the neighbor said. "But I heard tell you got yourself a wife now. Mail order bride, they say." Violet's hands stilled on the clothespin she was holding. She'd been waiting for this, the questions, the judgments, the looks that said she was something shameful. "That's right," Gabriel replied, his voice steady. "Brave man buying a pig in a poke like that. Could have gotten anything. Diseased, crazy, used goods." The clothespin snapped in Violet's fingers. She waited for Gabriel's response, her whole body tense with the expectation of humiliation. I got exactly what I wanted, Gabriel said finally. A good woman who deserves better than she's had. The neighbor laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. You're either a saint or a fool, Morrison. Hope you don't regret your charity case. The only thing I regret, Gabriel said, and now there was steel in his voice, is that some men don't know the difference between strength and meanness. That evening, Gabriel found Violet sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire and gold. He settled beside her, careful to leave space between them, and they sat in comfortable silence for a long while. I heard what you said today. Violet finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the evening wind. Gabriel nodded. Good. Why did you defend me to him? Gabriel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, my father used to beat our horses when they didn't understand what he wanted. Made them fear him so much they'd shake when he came near. But fear didn't make them better horses, just broken ones. Violet looked at him, seeing something in his profile that made her understand why his animals trusted him. What happened to them? After he died, it took me 2 years to earn their trust back. Some of them never did recover fully. Gabriel turned to look at her then, his eyes holding depths she was only beginning to fathom. But the ones that did, they became the finest horses I've ever known. Gentle but strong. Brave because they knew they were safe. The words hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. But for the first time since arriving at the homestead, Violet allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to stop running, to stop hiding, to believe that safety could be more than just a locked door. As the stars began to appear in the endless Nebraska sky, she made a decision that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Tomorrow she would start trying to trust. The blizzard hit like a living thing with teeth and claws, turning the world white and wild in the space of an hour. Violet pressed her face to the kitchen window, watching Gabriel battle through the snow toward the barn, his lantern a tiny yellow star in the howling darkness. She'd lived through Philadelphia winters, but nothing had prepared her for the raw power of a prairie storm. The wind shrieked around the house like a banshee, making the walls shudder and the windows rattle in their frames. Even with the fire crackling in the stove, cold seeped through every crack and crevice. When Gabriel stumbled back through the kitchen door, ice crystals glittered in his dark hair and beard like tiny diamonds. His face was red from the cold, and his hands shook as he pulled off his gloves. "The mare," he said, his breath coming in short puffs. "She's foaling, but something's wrong. The baby's turned the wrong way, and she's getting weaker." Violet's heart jumped. She'd helped birth foals before, back when her stepfather ran a stable and her hands were allowed to heal instead of just hurt. "I could help," she said, then caught herself. If you think." "Yes." Gabriel's response was immediate, no hesitation. "I'd be grateful for your help." They bundled into coats and scarves, Gabriel wrapping an extra blanket around Violet's shoulders before they stepped into the storm. The wind hit them like a physical blow, driving snow into their faces and stealing their breath away. Gabriel took her hand, the first time he'd done so without asking, and led her through the white chaos toward the barn. Inside, the storm's roar became a dull rumble, and the air smelled of hay and horse and the metallic scent of blood. The mare lay on her side in the largest stall, her breathing labored and her eyes wide with pain and fear. Violet knelt beside the struggling animal, her fears forgotten in the face of a creature that needed her help. Her hands, so long used only to protect herself, became instruments of mercy as she examined the mare. "The foal's shoulder is caught," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "I can turn it, but it's going to hurt her." Gabriel positioned himself at the mare's head, his voice low and soothing as he spoke to the frightened animal. "Easy, girl. We're going to help you. Just hold on." What followed was the longest hour of Violet's life. With Gabriel holding the mare steady and whispering encouragement, she worked to turn the foal, her hands guided by knowledge she'd thought lost forever. The mare fought and struggled, but Gabriel's calm presence seemed to reach her, and gradually she began to trust the hands that were trying to help. When the foal finally slipped free, covered in fluid and utterly still, Violet's heart nearly stopped. But then Gabriel was there, clearing the tiny nostrils with gentle fingers, and suddenly the barn filled with the weak but determined cry of new life. The colt was perfect, all long legs and big eyes, with a coat that would probably turn the same chestnut brown as his mother. He struggled to stand on wobbly legs, already searching for his first meal. "You did it," Gabriel said, and there was wonder in his voice. "You saved them both." Violet looked down at her hands, bloody and tired, but steady. For the first time in years, they'd been used to create instead of just endure. "We did it," she corrected softly. As they walked back to the house through the dying storm, Gabriel's hand found hers again. This time she didn't pull away. But as they approached the porch, Violet caught sight of something that made her blood turn to ice. There, barely visible in the swirling snow, was the outline of a man on horseback, watching the house from the tree line. Even through the storm, even at a distance, she knew that slouched posture, that cruel stillness. Marcus Hartwell had found her. The sanctuary she'd begun to trust, the peace she'd started to believe in, the man whose gentle hands had shown her what kindness looked like. All of it was about to be destroyed by the monster from her past. Gabriel noticed her sudden stillness. "What is it?" Violet opened her mouth to tell him, to warn him, to beg him to let her go quietly so Marcus wouldn't hurt him too. But when she looked back toward the trees, the figure was gone, vanished into the storm like a nightmare at dawn. "Nothing," she lied, hating herself for it. "Just thought I saw something." But as they entered the warm safety of the house, Violet knew her running days weren't over. Marcus had found her, which meant Marcus had plans for her. And those plans never included letting her be happy. The peace she'd found with Gabriel Morrison, the trust she'd started to build, the love she'd been afraid to name. All of it hung by a thread now, and that thread was about to be cut by the sharp blade of her past. Tomorrow, she would have to decide. Run again and keep Gabriel safe, or stay and fight for the first real home she'd ever known. The devil arrived with the dawn, riding a black horse and wearing Marcus Hartwell's face like a mask of pure evil. Violet watched from behind the kitchen curtain as her stepfather dismounted in their front yard, his cruel smile cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk. Gabriel was in the barn, tending to the new colt and its mother. He had no idea that death itself had just knocked on their door, wearing the form of a man who'd made Violet's childhood a living nightmare. Marcus straightened his coat and walked toward the house with the confidence of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with his fists or his lies. Violet's hands shook so violently she could barely hold the curtain as memories crashed over her like a flood. The beatings, the threats, the nights she'd hidden under her bed while he raged through the house like a drunken storm. The knock on the door came 3 times, slow and deliberate, the same pattern he'd used when he wanted to terrify her as a child. Violet backed away from the door, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst right out of her chest. "Violet, darling," Marcus called through the wood, his voice honey-sweet and poison-deadly. "I know you're in there. Open up for your old papa. We need to have ourselves a little chat." She pressed herself against the far wall, wishing she could disappear into the wallpaper. Maybe if she stayed quiet, maybe if she didn't move, he'd go away. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was foolish. Marcus Hartwell never gave up when he wanted something, and he'd traveled too far to leave empty-handed. The door handle turned. Gabriel never locked it during the day, and Marcus stepped inside like he owned the place. He was exactly as Violet remembered, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and eyes like chips of dirty ice. His clothes were expensive but travel-worn, and he carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd spent his life taking what wasn't his. "There's my girl," he said, spotting her against the wall. "Lord, you've filled out nice. Prairie life must agree with you." Violet found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "How did you find me?" Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever? I've got friends in every territory, sweetheart. Friends who keep their ears open for runaway property. I'm not your property. I'm married now. Legal and proper." "Married?" Marcus looked around the clean, comfortable kitchen with obvious disdain. To some dirt farmer who thinks he can steal what belongs to me? Where is this husband of yours? I'd like to meet the fool who bought damaged goods without knowing what he was getting. Before Violet could answer, Gabriel's boots sounded on the porch. The kitchen door opened, and he stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Violet's terrified face before shifting to the stranger who'd invaded their home. "You must be Morrison," Marcus said, extending his hand with false friendliness. "Marcus Hartwell. I've come to collect my stepdaughter." Gabriel ignored the offered handshake, his storm-cloud eyes steady and cold. "She's not yours to collect. She's my wife, and this is our home." Marcus's fake smile never wavered. "Oh, I think you might change your mind when you learn what you've really married. See, little Violet here has some debts to pay, some obligations that go way back. And I'm afraid her contract with you isn't worth the paper it's written on." "What contract?" Gabriel's voice was quiet, but Violet could hear the steel underneath. "The one her real father signed before he died. The one that promised her to me to settle his gambling debts." Marcus pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, yellowed with age and bearing official-looking seals. "All legal and binding. She's been mine since she turned 16, and I've been letting her play house long enough." Violet's legs gave out, and she slid down the wall to sit on the floor. The document Marcus held was real. She'd seen it before, on the night her stepfather had first shown her what her obligations would be. It was the reason she'd run, the reason she'd answered Gabriel's advertisement, the reason she'd believed she could escape a fate worse than death. Gabriel stepped forward, his hand extended toward the paper. "Let me see that." Marcus held it back, just out of reach. "I don't think so, farmer boy. This is between family. But I'll tell you what, I'm a reasonable man. I'll take the girl and forget about the money you've cost me by harboring stolen property. Consider it a wedding gift." "She's not property," Gabriel said again, and now his voice carried a warning that made even Marcus take a step back. "And she's not going anywhere with you." "Oh, but she is." Marcus's mask of politeness finally slipped, revealing the monster underneath. "Because if she doesn't, I'll burn this pretty little homestead to the ground. I'll kill every horse in your barn and salt your fields so nothing ever grows here again. And then I'll take her anyway, along with whatever's left of you." Violet watched in horror as Marcus's hand moved to the gun at his hip. She'd seen him use it before, had watched him put bullets through men who'd crossed him without batting an eye. Gabriel was brave and kind and good, but he wasn't a killer. Against a man like Marcus, all his gentle strength would mean nothing. "I'll go," she said, her voice small but clear in the sudden silence. "I'll go with you if you promise not to hurt him." Both men turned to look at her, Gabriel's face showing pain and betrayal, Marcus's showing triumph. She forced herself to stand, to walk across the kitchen toward the monster who'd haunted her dreams for years. "That's my good girl," Marcus purred, reaching out to touch her face. But before his hand could reach her, Gabriel moved. Not with violence, but with purpose. He stepped between them, his body shielding Violet from Marcus's reach. "She's not going anywhere," Gabriel said. "And neither are you." From outside came the sound of horses approaching fast, their hooves thundering on the frozen ground. Marcus's head snapped toward the window, his confidence faltering for the first time since he'd arrived. "Expecting company, Morrison?" he asked, but his voice had lost its mocking tone. Gabriel's lips curved in the first smile Violet had seen from him since Marcus arrived. "As a matter of fact, I am." The kitchen door burst open, and Sheriff Davidson stepped inside with 2 deputies behind him, their badges gleaming in the morning light. The lawman's weathered face was grim as he looked at Marcus, and his hand rested casually on his gun. "Marcus Hartwell," the sheriff said in a voice like gravel. "You're under arrest for fraud, assault, human trafficking, and about a dozen other charges that good folks shouldn't have to hear before breakfast." Marcus's face went white, then red, then white again. "You can't prove anything. That girl's mine by law, and I've got the papers to prove it." "Those papers." Sheriff Davidson pulled an identical document from his pocket, except this one was marked with red ink across the front. "These papers?" The ones declared fraudulent by a Philadelphia court 3 weeks ago? The ones that were never legal to begin with because her father never owed you a gambling debt. He was murdered by your associates before he could pay his legitimate debts to the bank. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Violet grabbed onto Gabriel's arm to keep from falling as the sheriff's words sank in. My father murdered? Shot dead in an alley by men who worked for Hartwell here. The Philadelphia police have been looking for him for years, and thanks to your husband's letters, they finally know where to find him. Gabriel's letters. Violet turned to stare at the man who'd become her husband, seeing him with new eyes. While she'd been learning to trust, while she'd been afraid of the past catching up with her, he'd been working behind the scenes to make sure it could never hurt her again. Marcus made a desperate grab for his gun, but the deputies were faster. In seconds, he was on the floor with his hands cuffed behind his back, all his power and menace reduced to the pathetic struggling of a caught rat. How? Violet whispered to Gabriel as the lawman hauled Marcus to his feet. Gabriel's eyes were gentle as he looked at her, full of a love she was only beginning to understand. Because some fights are worth fighting, even when they take months of letters and investigation and waiting for justice to catch up. Because you deserved to know the truth. And because I couldn't let you spend the rest of your life afraid of shadows. As Marcus was dragged away, still cursing and threatening, Violet realized that everything she'd believed about her past, about her worth, about her future, had just changed forever. She wasn't damaged goods or stolen property or a debt to be paid. She was free. The silence that followed Marcus's departure felt different from any quiet Violet had ever known. Not the fearful holding of breath, but the peaceful exhale of a soul finally allowed to rest. She stood in the kitchen where moments before her worst nightmare had played out, watching Gabriel as he moved around the room with calm efficiency, putting things back in their proper places as if evil could be swept away like dust. How long have you known? She asked, her voice stronger than it had been in years. Gabriel paused in his straightening, a coffee cup in his hands. Known what, exactly? About the papers. About my father. About Marcus. She moved to the window, looking out at the empty yard where her stepfather's horse had stood just minutes before. How long have you been investigating? Gabriel set down the cup and turned to face her fully. Since the second week you were here. Something about your fear didn't sit right with me. The way you flinched, the way you talked about your stepfather. It reminded me too much of my father's horses. The comparison should have stung, but instead it felt like understanding. So you wrote letters. To every sheriff's office between here and Philadelphia. To the courts. To anyone who might have records of Marcus Hartwell and his business dealings. Gabriel's voice was matter-of-fact, as if orchestrating the downfall of a dangerous criminal was simply part of taking care of his household. It took time, but eventually the pieces started fitting together. Violet tried to imagine it. Gabriel sitting at his desk by lamplight, night after night, writing careful letters to strangers, building a case against a man he'd never met to protect a woman he barely knew. The patience it must have taken, the faith in justice, the quiet determination to make things right. Why didn't you tell me? Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Because you needed to heal first. Because I wanted you to learn to trust me before you had to trust the law. And because... He hesitated, then continued with careful honesty. Because I was afraid you'd run if you knew Marcus was looking for you. The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Violet realized he was right. If she'd known Marcus was hunting her, she would have disappeared into the night rather than bring danger to Gabriel's door. The man who'd shown her such patient kindness had understood her better than she'd understood herself. And now? She asked. Now that it's over? Gabriel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll that months of secret worry had taken on him. Now you're free to choose. You can stay because you want to, not because you have nowhere else to go. You can leave if that's what makes you happy. The choice is yours, Violet. Maybe for the first time in your life. The word choice echoed in her mind like a bell ringing in an empty church. When had she ever truly chosen anything? Her mother's death had been chosen for her. Marcus's cruelty had been forced upon her. Even coming to Nebraska had been running from something rather than running toward it. But now, standing in this kitchen that smelled of coffee and fresh bread, looking at a man who'd fought for her freedom without asking for anything in return, she had a real choice to make. "I want to stay," she said, and the words felt like the first true thing she'd ever spoken. "But not as your mail-order bride. Not because of a contract or an obligation or because I have nowhere else to go." Gabriel's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear. Then why? Violet took a breath, gathering courage she didn't know she possessed. "Because somewhere between the broken coffee cup and the blizzard, between the gentle way you treat your horses and the patient way you treated my fears, I fell in love with you. Real love, Gabriel. The kind that chooses to stay even when staying is scary." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful and true. Gabriel's face went through a dozen emotions in the space of a heartbeat. Surprise, joy, relief, and something deeper that made Violet's heart skip like a stone across water. "Violet," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I've been in love with you since the day you helped birth that colt in the storm. Maybe even before that. You're the bravest person I've ever known." "I'm not brave," she protested. "I'm terrified most of the time." Gabriel stepped closer, close enough to touch her face with gentle fingertips. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared. You've been doing that since the day you got on that train to come here." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the rough, demanding kisses she'd learned to fear. This was soft and sweet and asking rather than taking, a question instead of a demand. When she kissed him back, it felt like coming home to herself. They broke apart slowly, foreheads touching, breathing the same air in the golden afternoon light that streamed through the kitchen windows. "So what happens now?" Violet asked. Gabriel smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Now we stop pretending this is just a business arrangement. Now we get married for real, with a real wedding and real vows and real promises. Now we build a life together because we choose to, not because we have to. And if I have bad days, if the nightmares come back, if I flinch at shadows that aren't there," Gabriel's hands found hers, steady and warm and sure. "Then we face them together. Healing isn't something that happens once, Violet. It's something you choose every day, and I want to be here for every one of those choices." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming snow and the promise of winter's challenges ahead. But inside the kitchen of the Morrison homestead, two souls who'd found each other across the vast loneliness of the prairie began planning a future built on choice rather than necessity, on love rather than obligation, on hope rather than fear. For the first time in her life, Violet Hartwell wasn't running from something. She was running toward it, toward a life she'd never dared dream possible, with a man who'd shown her that the strongest love was also the gentlest. The broken girl who'd stepped off the train in Clearwater Station was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to claim the happiness she deserved. The church bells of Clearwater Station rang out like silver laughter on the crisp spring morning, announcing to the world that Gabriel Morrison and Violet Hartwell were about to make promises that would last a lifetime. But first, Violet had to survive the most terrifying challenge she'd faced since Marcus's arrest, meeting the entire town as Gabriel's chosen bride. Mrs. Davidson, the sheriff's wife, had taken charge of the wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of a general planning a military campaign. She'd swept into the Morrison homestead 3 days earlier, armed with fabric samples, flower catalogs, and opinions about everything from the proper length of wedding veils to the correct way to arrange chairs in the church. "Now, dear," Mrs. Davidson said, adjusting Violet's simple white dress for the 100th time, "you mustn't be nervous. The whole town's been talking about nothing else for weeks. Everyone's so curious to finally meet Gabriel's mysterious bride properly." Violet's stomach churned at the word curious. In her experience, curiosity from strangers usually led to judgment, and judgment led to pain. But Gabriel had assured her that the people of Clearwater Station were different, that they cared more about kindness than gossip, more about character than circumstance. Through the small window of the church's back room, Violet could see wagons and horses filling the yard as families arrived for the ceremony. Children ran between the adults, their voices bright with excitement, while women in their Sunday best gathered in small groups, no doubt discussing the bride they'd only glimpsed from a distance. "What if they don't like me?" Violet whispered to Mrs. Davidson, who was now fussing with the wildflower bouquet that Gabriel had picked himself from the prairie. The older woman stopped her fussing and took Violet's hands in her own weathered ones. "Child, Gabriel Morrison is the most respected man in 3 counties. If he chose you, that's all the recommendation anyone with sense needs. And if anyone doesn't have sense, well, they'll have to answer to me." The fierceness in Mrs. Davidson's voice reminded Violet that she wasn't facing this alone. In the months since Marcus's arrest, she'd slowly begun to understand that Gabriel wasn't the only one who'd chosen to protect her. The whole community had quietly, without fanfare, decided she belonged. When Dr. Peterson had made his monthly visit to check on the new colt, he'd also examined the fading scars on Violet's arms and pronounced her healing beautifully, inside and out. When the general store owner, Mr. Baker, had learned that Violet could read and write better than most, he'd offered her work keeping his books. Even the minister, Reverend Williams, had spent hours talking with her about faith and forgiveness, never once making her feel judged for her past. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Mrs. Davidson called. Gabriel stepped inside, wearing a suit that made him look more handsome than any man had a right to be. His dark hair was neatly combed, his boots polished to a shine, but it was the look in his storm-cloud eyes that took Violet's breath away. Love and pride and wonder all mixed together. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and Violet felt beautiful for the first time in her life. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, meaning more than just the ceremony. Gabriel understood. "I've been ready since the day you helped birth that colt in the storm. The question is, are you ready to be Mrs. Morrison in front of God and everybody?" Violet thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that train. Broken, afraid, convinced she was worth nothing more than the cruelty she'd endured. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming. Someone who could birth foals and bake bread and choose love over fear, even when fear felt safer. "Yes," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I'm ready." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of music and flowers, and faces turned toward them with genuine joy. Reverend Williams spoke about love that endures, about choosing each other every day, about becoming something stronger together than either could be alone. When Gabriel placed the simple gold ring on her finger, the same ring he'd crafted with his own hands months earlier, Violet felt the last chains of her past fall away. But it was when they spoke their own vows that the real magic happened. Gabriel's voice was steady and sure as he promised to love her not despite her scars, but because of the strength they represented. He vowed to be her sanctuary when the world felt too big, her anchor when fear tried to sweep her away. When it was Violet's turn, her voice started small but grew stronger with each word. She promised to trust him with her fears, to share her hopes, to believe in the future they would build together. She vowed to love him not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones too, through prairie storms and difficult seasons and whatever challenges life might bring. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers. But Violet only had eyes for Gabriel, for the man who'd shown her that love could be gentle, that strength could be quiet, that home wasn't a place but a person. The celebration continued at the church hall, where tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family in town. There was music and dancing and laughter that echoed off the walls like joy made audible. Children ran between the tables while adults shared stories and offered marriage advice that ranged from practical to hilarious. But the moment that stayed with Violet came when old Mrs. Patterson, the town's unofficial grandmother, pulled her aside near the punch bowl. "I want you to know something, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice gentle but firm. "We've all heard whispers about your past, about why you came here, and I want you to know that not a soul in this town cares about anything except the woman you are today." Violet's eyes filled with tears. "But what if? What if nothing?" Mrs. Patterson interrupted kindly. "We judge trees by their fruit, not by the soil they grew in. And the fruit you've borne since coming here. The kindness, the courage, the way you've made Gabriel happier than we've ever seen him. That's all that matters to us. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift away, Violet found herself standing on the church steps with Gabriel, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Her hand was warm in his, the simple ring catching the last light of day. "No regrets?" Gabriel asked softly. Violet looked out at the vast sky, at the endless grassland that had become home, at the town that had welcomed her without reservation. For the first time in her life, the future stretched before her not as a threat to be feared, but as a gift to be unwrapped one day at a time. "None," she said, and knew she spoke the truth. "This is exactly where I belong." The morning sun painted the Morrison homestead in shades of gold and promise as Violet stood in her garden, dirt under her fingernails and joy in her heart. 5 years had passed since that scared girl had stepped off the train in Clearwater Station, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Where once there had been empty prairie, now rows of vegetables grew in neat lines, tomatoes and corn, beans and squash, herbs that filled the air with their sweet and savory scents. Violet had discovered she had a gift for growing things, for coaxing life from the hard Nebraska soil with the same patience Gabriel had used to coax trust from her wounded heart. "Mama! Mama!" 2 voices called from the direction of the house, and Violet looked up to see her twin daughters racing across the yard toward her. Emma and Rose, 4 years old and identical except for the mischievous sparkle in Emma's eyes and the gentle thoughtfulness in Rose's, were the light of her life. "What is it, my darlings?" Violet asked, catching both girls in a hug that smelled of sunshine and childhood and endless possibility. "Papa says the new horses are ready to see people," Emma announced, practically bouncing with excitement. "And Mrs. Johnson is here with her baby," Rose added in her quieter voice. "The one who cries all the time." Violet smiled, understanding immediately. Mrs. Johnson was the latest woman to find sanctuary at the Morrison homestead, a young mother who'd fled an abusive husband with nothing but the clothes on her back and a colicky infant. She was the 7th woman they'd helped over the years, part of a quiet network that had grown around their kitchen table. "Then we'd better go welcome her properly," Violet said, taking her daughter's hands as they walked toward the house. The homestead had expanded over the years, growing to accommodate both Gabriel's horse training business and their unofficial role as a safe haven for women in need. A second barn housed the gentle horses that Gabriel trained using methods as patient as his approach to healing hearts. A smaller building served as temporary housing for women who needed time and space to decide what came next in their lives. Inside the main house, Gabriel sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Johnson, speaking in the same quiet, steady voice he'd once used to calm Violet's fears. The baby slept in his arms. Gabriel had always possessed a magic touch with children and frightened creatures of all kinds. "Sarah," Gabriel said, looking up as Violet entered, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Violet. She's been where you are now." Mrs. Johnson looked up with eyes that Violet recognized. The careful, measuring gaze of someone who'd learned that safety was never guaranteed, that kindness often came with hidden costs. She was young, probably not much older than Violet had been when she'd arrived, with dark hair and skin pale from too many sleepless nights. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said formally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just Violet, please," Violet replied, settling into the chair across from her. "And you don't have to say anything you're not ready to say. We're just glad you're here." Over the next hour, Violet watched Gabriel work his quiet magic. He asked no probing questions, made no demands for explanations. Instead, he talked about practical things, where Sarah and the baby could sleep, when meals were served, how the lock on the bedroom door worked from the inside. Small details that spoke of safety and choice and respect for boundaries. Emma and Rose, with the easy acceptance of children, quickly appointed themselves the baby's protectors. They showed Sarah their favorite hiding spots in the house, explained which of the barn cats were friendliest, and offered to share their collection of smooth stones from the creek. "How do you do it?" Sarah asked Violet as they watched the girls play with the baby on a blanket in the front yard. "How do you trust again after everything?" Violet considered the question, thinking back to her own journey from broken victim to confident woman. "One day at a time," she said finally, "and with people who prove over and over that they're worthy of trust." Gabriel never rushed me, never demanded more than I could give. He just waited. And while he waited, he showed me what real love looked like. What if I can't? What if I'm too damaged? The words hit Violet like an echo from her own past. "You're not damaged," she said firmly. "You're surviving. There's a difference. Damage is something that can't be fixed. But what we've been through, that's just living with scars. And scars are proof that we healed." That evening, after Sarah and the baby had been settled in their room and the girls were asleep, Violet found Gabriel on the porch where they'd shared so many quiet conversations over the years. He was reading a letter by lamplight, his face thoughtful. "Good news?" Violet asked, settling into the chair beside him. Gabriel smiled, the expression that still made her heart skip after all these years. "The best. The territorial legislature just passed a law making it easier for women to file for divorce from abusive husbands. And they're establishing a fund to help women start new lives." Violet felt a surge of pride and amazement. "Your letters again?" "Our letters," Gabriel corrected. "Your story, your strength, your willingness to speak up for women like Sarah. That's what made the difference." It was true. Over the years, Violet had found her voice in ways she'd never imagined possible. She'd written to lawmakers, testified at hearings, shared her story with newspapers that wanted to write about the changing West. Each time had been terrifying, but each time had also been healing. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten on that train?" Violet asked, leaning back in her chair to look up at the star-filled sky. Gabriel reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band that had become as much a part of her as breathing. "I think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Violet laughed softly. "That's very romantic for a practical man." "You bring out the romantic in me," Gabriel replied, and even after 5 years of marriage, the words still made her blush. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the prairie wind bend the grass in waves like a landlocked ocean, Violet thought about the woman she'd become. She was still Gabriel's wife, still the mother of his children, still the woman who grew vegetables and trained horses and helped birth foals in blizzards. But she was also something more, a voice for the voiceless, a sanctuary for the broken, a living example that no matter how dark the past, the future could still be bright. She'd learned that healing wasn't a destination but a journey, that strength wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. The mail-order bride who'd arrived in Clearwater Station all those years ago had been looking for escape. What she'd found instead was something far more valuable. A home, a family, a purpose, and most importantly, herself. In the distance, a coyote called across the prairie, its voice joining the eternal song of the wild places. Violet listened to the sound, no longer hearing loneliness in it, but freedom. Like the coyote, like the wind, like the endless sky above them, she had learned to sing her own song, a melody of survival and hope and love that echoed across the years like a promise kept. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women who needed sanctuary, new opportunities to make the world a little safer for those who had nowhere else to turn. But tonight, there was only this, the warmth of Gabriel's hand in hers, the sound of their children breathing safely in their beds, and the knowledge that sometimes the most broken things can become the most beautiful when they're given the chance to heal. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, but changed everything in the space of 13 words. "Marcus Hartwell escaped prison 3 days ago. Consider yourself warned. Sheriff Davidson." Violet's hands trembled as she read the yellow paper for the 3rd time, each word hitting her like a physical blow. She'd been hanging laundry on the line behind the house when young Tommy Peterson had ridden up on his pony, breathless and important with his delivery. Now the wet sheets hung forgotten as the past came roaring back like a prairie fire. Gabriel found her there 20 minutes later, still standing in the yard with the telegram clutched in her fist. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know, and his own expression shifted from concern to something harder, more dangerous. "When?" he asked simply. 3 days. Violet's voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow and distant. He could be anywhere by now. He could be watching us right now. Gabriel's eyes swept the horizon, taking in the open prairie that had always felt like freedom, but now seemed full of hiding places for monsters. Not watching, he said with quiet certainty. If Marcus was close enough to watch, he'd have made his move already. He's not a patient man. The reminder of Marcus's nature, his need for immediate gratification, his inability to plan beyond his next meal or drink, should have been comforting. Instead, it made Violet's skin crawl. An impulsive enemy was often more dangerous than a careful one. "What do we do?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, thinking with the methodical approach that had solved so many problems over the years. "We prepare. We make sure the girls know what to do if strangers come around. We ask the neighbors to keep their eyes open. And we trust that the law will catch him before he gets this far." But even as he spoke, Violet could see the doubt in his eyes. Nebraska territory was vast and wild, with countless places for a man to hide if he knew how to live rough. Marcus had always been good at disappearing when the law got too close. That evening, the Morrison homestead buzzed with quiet activity as neighbors arrived to help with preparations. Sheriff Davidson rode in from town with 2 deputies, their faces grim but determined. Dr. Peterson brought his hunting rifle and the latest news from the telegraph office. Even Reverend Williams came, not with weapons but with the calm presence that had comforted so many in times of trouble. The women gathered in the kitchen while the men made plans on the porch. Mrs. Davidson sat with Sarah Johnson and her baby, both women understanding that this threat extended to all of them. Mrs. Patterson brought her famous apple pie, because even in crisis, people needed to eat. "He won't come straight here," Sheriff Davidson explained to the group. "Marcus is cunning, but he's also angry. He'll want to make her suffer first, maybe go after people she cares about. He'll try to isolate her, make her feel helpless." Emma and Rose played quietly in the corner, sensing the adult tension but not understanding its source. Violet watched them, her heart breaking at the thought that her past might touch their innocent lives. She'd worked so hard to build a world where they could grow up safe and loved, free from the shadows that had shaped her own childhood. "Mama," Rose said softly, appearing at Violet's elbow with the sudden stealth children mastered so well. "Why is everyone scared?" Violet knelt down to her daughter's level, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes people from the past try to cause trouble, but we have lots of friends helping us stay safe." "Like when the wolves came last winter?" Emma asked, joining her sister. "Something like that," Violet agreed, remembering how the community had banded together to protect the livestock from a hungry wolf pack. "We look out for each other." The comparison was more accurate than her daughters knew. Marcus Hartwell was a predator, and like any predator, he was most dangerous when cornered or desperate. But unlike the wolves, he wouldn't be satisfied with just taking what he needed. He would want to destroy everything beautiful he found, simply because he could. As the evening wore on, plans took shape. Families would take turns watching the roads leading to the homestead. The church bell would ring a special pattern if danger was spotted. Women and children would gather at the most defensible houses if Marcus was sighted in the area. "What about Sarah?" Dr. Peterson asked, nodding toward the young mother who sat rocking her baby near the window. "She's not strong enough to travel, and the baby." "She stays here," Gabriel said firmly. "This is her sanctuary, and we don't abandon our own." The certainty in his voice made Violet's heart swell with pride and love. Even facing danger, Gabriel's first instinct was to protect the vulnerable, to stand as a shield between the innocent and the storm. But late that night, after the neighbors had gone home and the house had settled into uneasy quiet, Violet found herself unable to sleep. She stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit prairie and remembering another night years ago when she'd watched Marcus's shadow among the trees. "He's not coming tonight," Gabriel said softly from the bed, his voice carrying the calm assurance that had anchored her through so many storms. "How can you be sure?" Gabriel sat up, the moonlight turning his hair silver and his eyes gentle. Because you're not the same woman he terrorized all those years ago. You're stronger now, braver. You have people who love you, people who'll fight for you. And most importantly, you've learned your own worth. Violet turned from the window, seeing her husband clearly in the pale light. What if that's not enough? What if he? Then we face it together, Gabriel interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of an unbreakable promise. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what marriage means, Violet. That's what family means. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to face and overcome. But tonight, there was this, the warmth of love, the strength of community, and the knowledge that she was no longer the helpless girl who'd once cowered in Marcus Hartwell's shadow. She was Violet Morrison, wife and mother, sanctuary keeper and voice for the voiceless. And whatever Marcus thought he was coming to destroy, he would find instead a woman who'd learned to fight not just for herself, but for everyone she loved. The broken girl who'd stepped off that train was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who knew that some things were worth defending, no matter the cost. The final confrontation came not with thunder and lightning, but in the quiet of a Sunday morning when the church bells should have been calling the faithful to worship. Instead, they rang out in the urgent pattern that meant danger, their bronze voices carrying across the prairie like a warning cry that made every heart in Clearwater Station beat faster. Violet was braiding Emma's hair when the sound reached them, each clang of the bell like a nail in the coffin of their peaceful morning. Through the kitchen window, she could see Gabriel racing toward the house from the barn, his face set in lines of grim determination. "Mama," Rose whispered, sensing the sudden tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. "What's happening?" Before Violet could answer, Gabriel burst through the kitchen door, his eyes immediately finding hers across the room. "He's here." Thompson spotted him about 2 miles east, heading this way on foot. The words hit Violet like cold water, shocking but not surprising. She'd known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like distant thunder. Now that it was here, she found herself strangely calm, as if all the fear and worry of the past weeks had crystallized into something harder, more focused. "Girls," she said, her voice steady and sure, "go to Mrs. Johnson's room and stay with her. Lock the door and don't come out until Papa or I come for you." Emma started to protest, but something in her mother's tone stopped her. Both girls kissed Violet quickly and ran toward the stairs, their bare feet pattering on the wooden steps like rain on a roof. "The others?" Violet asked Gabriel. "On their way. Sheriff Davidson is 5 minutes behind me, and the neighbors are spreading out to cover the approaches. But Marcus is moving fast, and he knows these prairie trails better than we thought." Violet nodded, her mind working with a clarity that surprised her. "He'll come to the front door. He always did like to make an entrance." Gabriel checked his rifle, the familiar motion steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "You don't have to face him, Violet. You can go upstairs with the girls and—" "No." The word came out sharp and final. "I won't hide from him anymore. I won't let him think he still has power over me." Gabriel's eyes searched her face, looking for signs of the fear that had once paralyzed her. What he found instead was resolve, the quiet strength of a woman who'd found her backbone and intended to keep it. "Then we face him together," he said, echoing the promise he'd made so many nights before. They didn't have to wait long. Marcus Hartwell appeared at the edge of the yard like a nightmare made flesh, moving with the confident swagger of a man who believed the world owed him everything. He was thinner than Violet remembered, his clothes worn and dirty from days of hard travel, but his eyes still held the same cruel intelligence that had haunted her dreams. "Well, well," Marcus called out as he approached the house, his voice carrying the mocking tone she remembered too well. "Look what prosperity has done for my little stepdaughter. Nice house, nice husband, nice little life built on lies and stolen time." Gabriel stepped onto the porch, his rifle held ready but not yet raised. "That's close enough, Hartwell." Marcus stopped about 20 feet from the porch, close enough for conversation but too far for a sudden rush. His eyes flicked from Gabriel to the windows of the house, calculating distances and possibilities. Where's the law, Morrison? I expected a warmer welcome for a family reunion. On their way, Gabriel replied evenly. But they're not needed. You're going to turn around and walk away. Marcus laughed, the sound like breaking glass on stone. Am I now? And what makes you think I'll do that? Before Gabriel could answer, Violet stepped onto the porch beside him. The moment Marcus saw her, his expression changed, the cruel amusement replaced by something darker and more focused. There she is, he said softly. My little runaway. You've caused me a lot of trouble, Violet. A lot of expensive, dangerous trouble. Good, Violet said, and her voice carried none of the tremor Marcus expected to hear. I hope it was worth every minute you spent in that prison cell. Marcus's face darkened at the reminder of his incarceration. You think you're safe here? You think this farmer and his friends can protect you from what's coming? I think, Violet said, stepping forward until she stood at the edge of the porch, that you're a tired old man who's spent so much time hurting people weaker than himself that he's forgotten what real strength looks like. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but before he could draw it, the sound of hoofbeats thundered across the prairie. Sheriff Davidson and his deputies rode into the yard like avenging angels, their badges gleaming in the morning sun. Marcus Hartwell, the sheriff called out, his voice carrying the authority of law and justice. You're under arrest. Again. Marcus's eyes darted between the lawman, Gabriel's rifle, and the faces of neighbors who'd appeared at the edges of the yard. For the first time since Violet had known him, he looked uncertain, like a predator who'd suddenly realized he was outnumbered by the prey. This isn't over, he snarled, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Violet said, and this time she did step down from the porch, walking toward the man who'd terrorized her childhood with steady, fearless steps. It's been over since the day I chose to stop running. You have no power here, Marcus. You have no power over me. When she stopped just out of his reach, close enough to see the rage and frustration in his eyes, Marcus made one last desperate grab for control. His hand closed around the gun at his hip, but before he could clear leather, 3 rifles were pointed at his chest. Don't, Gabriel said quietly, and something in his tone made Marcus freeze. Don't make us do something we'll all regret. For a long moment, the world balanced on the edge of violence. Then Marcus's shoulders sagged, and his hand fell away from his weapon. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon, leaving behind only a broken man who'd spent his life building nothing but pain. As the deputies moved in to make the arrest, Violet felt something she'd never expected: pity. This man who'd loomed so large in her nightmares, who'd shaped her fears and stolen her childhood, was just a small, bitter creature who'd never learned that strength came from building up rather than tearing down. Goodbye, Marcus, she said as they led him away. I forgive you. The words surprised everyone, including herself. But as she spoke them, Violet felt the last chains of her past fall away. Forgiveness wasn't about Marcus deserving it. It was about her refusing to carry his poison any longer. Later, as the sun set over the Nebraska prairie and their daughters played safely in the yard, Violet stood in her garden among the vegetables she'd coaxed from the hard ground with patience and love. Gabriel found her there, just as he had so many evenings before. Any regrets? He asked, the same question he'd posed on their wedding day. Violet looked around at the life they'd built together, the house full of laughter and love, the community that had rallied to protect them, the knowledge that she'd found her voice and used it to help others find theirs. Only one, she said, taking his hand in hers. Gabriel's eyebrows rose in surprise. What's that? Violet smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy. That it took me so long to realize I was worth fighting for. In the distance, the evening star appeared in the darkening sky, a point of light in the vast darkness that reminded them both that even in the deepest night, there was always something beautiful to guide the way home. The mail-order bride who'd arrived in Clearwater Station so many years ago had been looking for safety. What she'd found instead was something far more precious: the knowledge that she was strong enough to create her own safety, wise enough to recognize real love when it found her, and brave enough to stand up for herself and others who needed defending. Her story wasn't just about surviving the past anymore. It was about building a future where love was stronger than fear, where community was more powerful than cruelty, and where even the most broken hearts could learn to sing again. As the prairie wind carried the scent of growing things and the promise of tomorrow across the endless grassland, Violet Morrison knew that her real life, the one she'd chosen rather than endured, was just beginning.